I'd like to talk about one's perception. That's not a new thought, not very unusual. Everyone knows that we have perception, but perception is the kind of thing that we rarely actually analyze until we are so uncomfortable with something that we've perceived that we have to do something about it. For instance, if we were to perceive, let's say, a situation or scenario in our life that made us extremely uncomfortable and could not get past it in some way, could not overcome that discomfort, we'd have to sit down and analyze it. We'd have to think what we are seeing and how we are feeling what we're feeling and what can be done to change it, and so on and so forth. But those perceptions are extremely complicated. They're very visible. They're very overbearing in the sense that if we're really suffering, it really hits us, it drags on us, it pulls on us, and we can really feel it. What we hardly ever analyze are the most subtle perceptions. Those are the things that we take for granted. We leave them alone. We don't think about them at all. We find ourselves, in the worst case, moving through hours, days, weeks, sometimes months, with no awareness that we've perceived hours, days, and weeks worth of time. We simply move through in a very unconscious method, kind of like The Walking Dead, unfortunately. And that's happened to all of us. This is not something I'm criticizing anyone particularly about. It's happened to all of us, where we've eaten a meal and said, "Did I taste that? What was that I just ate?" You just gobbled it down and you didn't taste anything. Or your mind was in a different direction and you weren't tasting anything. Or perhaps spent the evening watching television and could not recount anything that you saw. You realized that you had offed somewhere in your brain. Or perhaps spent a couple of hours doing your meditation and practice and really could not remember which prayers you had said. The process was somehow so mindless. Or perhaps you could look back at the end of the day and wonder where the day went. We've all had that feeling, haven't we? We've all gone into a kind of sleepwalking kind of state. In some cases, it might be so that that's a survival mechanism, that the organism needs to fade out for a while in order to rest and recoup. Sometimes, in some cases, we train ourselves to live like that because we have lived through some trauma. But from the deepest point of view, from the point of view of Buddha Dharma, that is actually a karmic condition called ignorance or dullness that we all have, and it's part of our karmic condition. But in fact, we do perceive constantly, and we don't think about it. Here we are perceiving a glass of water with lemon in it. And we don't really take account of that. We don't really think how amazing it is that the water is wet. We don't think about the temperature of the water. We don't think that it's being held in this glass. We don't think about what would happen if we dumped it out. We don't think about how we perceive it under different conditions. Like right now, I would get a little nervous if this water weren't here. And the reason why is that my mouth gets dry when I talk. But there are lots of times when you have a glass of water and it's just nothing. It's no big deal. What's a glass of water? There's plenty of water around. But if you just run a race or done some exercise, a glass of water is like God. If you've just worked out, maybe done some aerobics, and somebody gives you a glass of cool water, it's like you're stimulated. You really want that water. You can just taste it. You really need it. And if any of you have gotten to the point through exertion or through being in a dry climate where you are so thirsty that you can't think of anything else, water takes on a whole different kind of experience. It's just so amazing. I remember when I was in India and you had to go to stores and you never knew which stores sold it, but you'd have to go to stores and buy bottled water. Otherwise you'd have to drink hot tea from a restaurant, and when it's boiling hot outside, you'd probably pull the ears off your grandmother to get some cool water. I mean, you'd do anything, to get some water. And so water became a very important thing. I don't know about that, pulling your ears off your grandmother, but it seemed like a very expressive way to put this out. Certainly cuts a picture, doesn't it? So anyway, water becomes so important. And then, have you ever thought about the difference in the perceptual experience that you've had? of water being almost invisible, or water being life, everything. So important. And in the course of human relationships, that's happened to us too, that we've been with a certain person, and the person is our friend, or our husband, or our wife, or what have you, or child, and we spend days, years maybe with that person, taking them for granted. Nothing. We think of nothing. It's just dull. The process is dull and it's kind of stupid. And then suddenly we lose that person, whether temporarily or permanently. Or that person turns away from us, or something happens, and suddenly we realize the value of something so precious. And we wonder how it was that we could have wasted so much time, and we wonder why can't we play that time back and have it back again? So perception is an interesting bit to play with, isn't it? It's really interesting. The basis of perception, according to the Buddha's teaching, is the fundamental idea of individuality. The fundamental idea of self-nature being real and solid. Now, if you think about it, the way that one must understand self-nature is to distinguish self from other. You can see that, can't you? It has to be done. One could not conceive of self-nature without distinguishing self from other. Otherwise, it would have no meaning. Self-nature would not be a perceptual experience that was contained within a certain definition. It would have no meaning. Without distinguishing between self and other, one might have perception, but that perception would not be subjective-objective. It would be non-specific. It would be more like wakefulness. More like wakefulness. But that isn't the case with our perception. Our perception is based on distinguishing self from other. And that is constantly the case. And if you cannot understand that, you have to perform little tests on yourself. And you'll see that that is true. Normal waking consciousness is really based on distinguishing self from other. Because one, in order to proceed, in order to move, in order to have being, and that is the basis of perception as we know it, one must be able to see how to negotiate. One must have that distinguishing process. And it is as instinctive and as immediate as... I don't have a way to compare it, actually. It's completely instinctive and completely immediate. There's no space in which one decides whether to distinguish between self and other. It is an automatic, habitual response. And we've been doing it not only since the beginning of this life, but since time out of mind, since the first idea of self-nature as being inherently real. That has been going on. So that is the basis of that kind of perception. Now, there really isn't such a difficulty in that. One would think that the idea of self-nature would be the problem. But that really isn't what the Buddha taught. It's the basis or the foundation for all problems to come, in a sense. But the Buddha taught us that all suffering actually comes from desire. From desire. When we begin to experience self-nature as inherently real, how does this desire come about? I think we think of that in the wrong way. In the same way that we have a prejudice against, say, money. We think that money is the root of all evil. That's not true. Money is a little coin, or it's a little piece of silver or copper, a little piece of paper. It's just something. It's like this, or it's like this, or it's like this. That's all it is. It's nothing. With this thing, if I were to blow my nose in it because I had a cold, that would be very good. This would be serving sentient beings, wouldn't it? Suddenly this tissue becomes a great bodhisattva. Serving sentient beings, and you don't have to be offended by my wet nose, right? That's a disgusting example, but it's true. Now supposing I were to take this and dip it in some water and throw spitballs at you. and hurt you in some way, or mess up your clothes. Some of you have some really nice clothes on. Supposing I were to mess up your clothes. Then suddenly this would become an evil thing. Well, not the evilest of things, but a mildly evil thing. Just for those of you that like to nitpick, maybe there's a couple of you in the crowd. And make sure that we totally understand each other. So anyway, it's a mildly evil thing. So, then we have to wonder, what is the nature of this piece of phenomena? Well, it's just that, a piece of phenomena. And that's the way money is, and that's the way perception is. It's just what it is. It's just what it is. For one to distinguish self-nature, for one to have the idea of self, for one to distinguish an object, these things are not intrinsically problematic. They are not really a big deal. But what happens is that when one perceives self and other, there is an exaggeration of that process that naturally occurs. And it seems to occur as a matter of fact. It just seems to occur in a very natural way. And that exaggeration is a kind of reactive process. And again, that reactive process need not necessarily occur, but it does, and it does so out of habitual tendency. And it's, again, not habitual tendency that has occurred in the last hour. It's not like smoking, you've done it for 10 years. It's not like even something that you've had the habit of since the beginning of your life. It's since time out of mind. We have the habit of reaction. The Buddha teaches us that we react with attraction, repulsion, or neutrality. You would think that of the three, neutrality would be the best, but in this instance, actually, neutrality is kind of like, if you could think of attraction and repulsion as two sides of the same coin, neutrality is like the tiny little edge around the coin. It's still part of that coin. And in the sense, it's almost like one has flipped it over and looked at both and decided on neutrality. It isn't really an unattached reaction. It is a reaction based on deciding whether you're attracted or repelled, going through that scenario, and just leaving it, just not having any big deal about it, not having it be very important in your psychological framework. Now you can test yourself on that, and you will find that everything that you perceive is coupled with some kind of reactive process. It's very simple to test yourself. You can ask someone to lead you blindfolded into a room, and then take off your blindfold and simply look around. If you have sensitivity, if you are accustomed to really examining your mind, you'll see that immediately perception begins to happen, and the first fundamental bias of that perception is to experience the distinction between self and other. You're immediately going to notice where you're standing. You're immediately going to perceive the room by seeing how big things are in comparison to you. For instance, this glass to me is pretty small. I can easily lift it. But to an ant, this would be a place to drown in. This would be a vacation at the seashore if the ant could swim. And so it's a big place for an ant. But for me, it's pretty small. And for an elephant, it's useless, it's so small. An elephant couldn't even get a drink of water out of this, or a bath, or anything. Couldn't even wash their ears. Nothing. So we have to understand that when we walk into this room and remove the blindfolds, what happens to us, the next steps that occur to us, are going to happen to us due to seeing the distinction between self and other. And perception is based on self-perception. In fact, all the perception, all the five senses, the common senses that we experience are actually an extension of one's own ego. They are perceived relative to self. That's easily understood. You know, a dog is going to perceive, even due to their size and their habit, certain things differently than you are. I mean, dogs perceive trees much differently than you do, especially little male dogs. Really. You understand that, don't you? So the whole perceptual process is really based on self-nature. So when you get into the room, you're not going to experience probably something that big. And the reason why is that you're going to see that you are in the room. You're going to see the room around you. Neither will you experience something as big as the world. Because due to your size, you'll be able to make relative comparisons. The next thing that will happen, and of course that's the way for you to understand that what you perceive is a direct display of the perception of self-nature as being inherently real. But the next thing that will happen to you is you will be hit with impressions, many different impressions. And different people have different kinds of perceptual experiences. Some people immediately perceive symmetry. Their minds are like that. They see if things are straight and organized. You know, some people notice immediately if a thing is clean or dirty. Some people notice color first off. Some people perceive that there's no one else in the room beside them. That's where their perception starts. Some people will perceive the amount of light and darkness in the room. Some people will react by trying to determine immediately where exactly they are so that they don't feel fearful. Different people have different kinds of perceptual experiences. And it's really weird to think about how absolutely unique our perceptual experiences are. Absolutely unique. While two people may walk into the room and experience for themselves the same room, and when pinned down can describe some of the same things, those two people are experiencing things very differently. One, because of the emotional content, one will experience a place of safety, one will experience a place of non-safety, one will experience big, one will experience little, one will experience organized, one will experience messy. These things are very, very different in people. But whether you perceive space, dirty or clean, color, light, content, whatever it is that you first experience, and you should actually watch your mind as your eyes open. What do you first see? You will begin to react with either attraction, repulsion, or neutrality to everything. To everything. It is impossible to engage in such a test as that and not have reaction come to the mind. If you try such a test and you feel no reaction, then the difficulty may be in your ability to feel what you're feeling. But everyone, whether it is subtle, unconscious, or whether it is very apparent, will engage in a reactive process. That is the nature of perception. And it would be really helpful, just as a lark, as a game in a sense, but a useful game, to learn to see that process, to learn to see how the mind actually works. In that way, one can become more competent with oneself, and one can become more competent in one's practice. To see the habit of reaction gives us a great understanding about our own experience. Now, another thing that you can do is to have yourself blindfolded and then have a person that you don't know walk into the room and stand in front of you, and then remove your blindfold. Wait till you see what happens then. According to your habit, you're going to notice different things. The way they comb their hair, the way they dress. Those are usually the first things, actually. Shape of their face, body build, stance, posture, stuff like that. And the sense of reaction will be overwhelming there. You're immediately going to start, almost like a computer, categorizing all these reactions. And pretty soon you come up with a sum total of, I think I like this person, maybe. And then when the person opens up their mouth, you'll form the rest of your opinion. depending on whether or not they're nice to you. So our habit, the exaggeration of perception, is to engage in reaction. How does this reaction actually occur? What is the psychological format for that? Well, it's a pretty broad subject, and it's kind of difficult to cover in a short period of time. But it's worth thinking about. Truly it is. The idea that self-nature is inherently real is such a strong and potent perceptual bias for us. It is an idea that we have had since time out of mind. That everything that we do, all of the perceptions that we have, must constantly enforce that perceptual bias. It must constantly happen. That we decide again and again and again, in a sense, that self-nature is inherently real. And that's because, in one way, that's because since we have had the idea of self-nature as being inherently real, since time out of mind, and since we have proceeded with this bias since time out of mind, we literally see nothing else. That is the fundamental bias. Everything that we see, everything that we understand, everything that we perceive is based on that. Everything comes from that. It's the root. So, when we have all of our perceptions, they are experienced in a sense as a kind of continuum. A continuum of self-nature moving through time. And if we think about it, every experience that we have had since we can remember has been the experience of self moving through time, a sense of continuum. We know no other experience. It's a bit like being born on a merry-go-round. If you're born on a merry-go-round and you spent your whole life going around like this, that's all you know, and you don't know that you're going around like this. You have no idea that you're doing that, because you have nothing to compare it to. There's nothing to compare it to. And if you stopped, if you got off the merry-go-round, having been born on the merry-go-round, you would probably feel like you were dying. It would be chaotic. There would be no understanding. And so we relate to the sense of continuum like that. The Lamas have told us that there is a purer kind of perception, that there is a very spacious, natural abiding that we can attain through our meditation. We don't believe that, because we don't know any better. We've never seen anything else. We hear that and we go, yeah, must be nice. And every now and then we get a real scary glimpse of it. You know, it's kind of like the person born on the merry-go-round looking off at those people standing still going, ew, that looks weird. So we get a little freaked out by the idea, actually. And even if we have a sense of spaciousness at some point, we don't know how to recognize it. If that merry-go-round were to slow down temporarily through our meditation, if we were to taste a piece of space, we wouldn't know how to recognize it. We know this continuum, and this continuum continues, and that's the nature of the continuum. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? But if you don't think about it, it can be a real revelation for you. So our experience is this self-nature moving through time and space, this continuum. Now, that being our experience, that being all that we know, we develop another exaggeration to that process, which is the process of clinging, process of ego clinging, of clinging to the safety of what we know, of clinging to continuum. And we aren't really willing to experience or perceive in any other way. we go with what we know. We don't have the instinct. We don't really have in fact, we have the opposite of that. We have the instinct to keep perceiving as we already perceive. And so we continue to move through time and space and resist what keeps us from that, or what potentially might show us a different way, I should say. And another monkey wrench in the works that's very difficult and makes things even more difficult is the one that actually produces suffering. Again, any experience that you have is purely that. It's purely a phenomenal experience. If like this tissue, you can pick it up and then put it down that easily, if it can fall through your fingers, if there's no attachment, if it's simply what it is and then it's gone and it's nothing, and there's some spaciousness in one's perception, if there's no clinging, perception is perception. It's no big deal. To use a very gross example, chocolate is the same as shit. Unless one decides that one really likes chocolate ever so much more. And in that case, chocolate becomes the staff of life, as it is in my house. So chocolate becomes very important, and it becomes something that you cling to. But otherwise, it's phenomena. There's this and this and this and this and this, and that's it. So big deal. And here's where the Buddha says we really start to put a hurting on ourselves. Of course, he didn't say it in quite that way. But we do experience this suffering, and this suffering is desire. So I've run through this whole scenario of different instances, different things that happen in order to get to this point. And do you see how we've gotten to this point? There was this fundamental bias of self-nature as being inherently real. There is this constant knee-jerk reaction process, or reactive process. And that reactive process is based on distinguishing self from other. And that distinguishing self from other is, again, instinctive, immediate. There's no space in that. It's immediate. Because we have already decided, we already have this fundamental bias, this fundamental assumption of self-nature as being inherently real. So this reactive process naturally occurs. This distinction process naturally occurs, and it's kind of a step thing. One builds on top of the other, and in a sense they're like gears. They're all very much linked. It would be very hard to separate any of those processes. But where the clinker comes in, the one that really puts the hurt into us, is where desire enters the picture. Once one moves into a very strong habitual bias toward ego clinging, once one moves into a very strong habitual tendency of reinforcing that through ensuring the safety of self-nature, one begins to develop in a subtle way the habit of desire. And the habit of desire, once begun in a subtle way, immediately begins to snowball. It immediately begins to snowball. It's like a forest fire. Desire feeds on itself. It increases itself and makes itself stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And pretty soon, it's a mire that one cannot get out of. If one engages in ego clinging, if one must keep the ego very safe and intact, then one must preen the ego. The ego has to, once you decide you have a self, then you really have to do something about it. You have to dress it up. You have to make it pretty. You have to make it smart. You have to make it this or that or the other thing. And according to your learning capacity, and according to your learning experience, and according to your karma, according to the habit of your mind, you begin to learn and formulate ideas about self-nature that you immediately begin to prove out hold on to and prove out. And it's a very strange thing. You would think it would be pretty cut and dry. You would think that hearing that, all we'd really want to know is that we're loved and that we're cute and that we're, have enough to eat and that we're kind of rich and that we're pretty smart and all that kind of stuff. It's much more complicated than that, actually. It's much more complicated than that. Because we haven't only lived one life. It would be so simple if we've only lived one life and we've decided that we're a self. And as a self, I want to be a beautiful self. And I want to be a smart self. And I want to be a rich self. I want to be a powerful self. And all of those things. In a sane situation, if one had all those thoughts to think about and one could make such decisions, perhaps those are the ideas that we would come up with. But that's not the case. Our roots of belief in self-nature are inconceivable. We've, since time out of mind, believed self-nature as being inherently real and accumulated the experience of self. Not only as a human being, but in many different times, under sane and insane conditions, and also not only as human being. According to the Buddha's teaching, we have lived many different lives in many different forms under extreme conditions. We've had an infinite amount of reaction time, an infinite amount of perception time, and we have all kinds of mental habitual tendencies to deal with, only a few of which are we aware of. We're only aware of the ones that obviously come to the surface of our minds. Like I'm aware that I think I'm a female. I mean, that's obvious, But deep, deep, deep inside, I, as well as you, have had many different kinds of experiences, of all kinds. So now this becomes extremely complicated, doesn't it? And you just throw up your hands and wonder, what am I supposed to do with this information? Perhaps just give some thought to perception. Perhaps just give some thought into understanding that the experience that you're having now should not just be taken for granted, but rather we should understand that, as the Buddha taught, we are wandering in cyclic existence. In a sense, and this is the way I put it, not the way the Buddha put it, wandering in a dream, like a perceptual fugue state in a way, like a dream, just due to this perception of continuum constantly occurring, and occurring in this way through habitual tendency. What is happening now that creates the most suffering is desire. We are now clinging to the idea of self-nature. It's all that we have ever known. To us, the idea of no self seems like death, chaos. We register the idea of known self as non-existence. We do. No self feels like non-existence. Actually, the Buddha never taught about non-existence. The Buddha taught about no self. There's a difference. But that's what our experience is, and that's what we know. Self-nature and the experience of moving through time and space, this continuum. And so we cling to self-nature. And since you've got a self, you've got to try to make it right somehow. You've got to try to get comfortable. If in the past you've experienced the karma of hatred and anger, in this life you're going to see a reflection of that. And sometimes people that have experienced a great deal of hatred and anger will have the habit of that, and they'll actually try to be happy and try to satisfy their desire by hurting others, believe it or not, by having power. Or perhaps in the past you've had a lot of experience of selfishness. Maybe even in an ignorant way, such as, I don't know, the selfishness of one animal stealing food from another animal. Maybe you have a lot of that kind of habit. And so now that habit will show itself in this lifetime. And in this lifetime, perhaps there's a poverty due to the reflection of that selfishness. The Buddha teaches us that the karma of that kind of selfishness would probably ripen as deprivation, a mental deprivation, sense of deprivation, and it would play out in the display of one's life. So it may be seen as poverty. Poverty. And so what does one do when one is poor? One tries to get more, tries to get more, tries to get more. Quick, let's make some money. Let's try to get some money. Let's try to get some money from you. Let me take some from you. And so the beat goes on, the pattern continues, and the suffering is there. Now, that person that is trying to get power over others, and that person that is experiencing poverty, what do you think the root of their problem is? The root of their problem is still desire. The interesting thing about those two people is that they both want to be happy. Isn't that odd? If you think about it, if a person robs a bank, they do so because they want to be happy. Even if a person kills somebody, a really terrible thing to do, I don't recommend it, ever. If a person kills, if a person does really horrible things, the kind of things where you read about people in the paper because they've done really awful things, that kind of thing, do you know that person wants to be happy? You know that that's the impulse that makes them do that? Do you realize that? But their confusion is so deep, and their habitual pattern is such a heavy drag that they perceive happiness in that way. A serial murderer who does horrible things to his victims feels like a rush of potency or something like that, and wishes to be happy, trying to keep on that rush of potency to have domination over others. It's twisted and it's ugly, but the thing that we as sentient beings all have in common is that we all wish to be happy. And the thing that messes us up every time is desire, and how twisted all of that can get. Now, of course, none of us are probably axe murderers. Are any of you here like serial murderers or anything like that? Oh, no. Well, listen, let me tell you. Future serial murderer. If I don't end this class soon, he's going to go after women with curly hair. We think about something as horrible as that, and it doesn't, in a way it doesn't make any sense, but in a way we can see that the confusion might be that the person still wishes to be happy. But do we understand that all of our motivation is about trying to be happy? And do we understand that it is our desire and our clinging to things that makes us unhappy? Those things are so hard to understand. And I think if one were to begin to think about meditation or to think about spiritual practice of any kind, one would want to run through some of the things that I'm talking about today. Really important. Eyes open, really get the big picture. Really try to see as best as you can what this is all about. And for those of you that have been practicing Buddha Dharma for some time, you do it too. And the reason why is because as a practitioner, we can fall into practicing by rote, meaning, I have to do my practice today. Or, time for me to meditate. Or, gee, I've taken this empowerment, so now I have to keep this commitment of practice every day. And you kind of get into that kind of thing, or it's just like, or even that, 5 o'clock, practice time, kind of mentality. And you really don't get the big picture. You forget. And you lose something there. You lose something really precious. And so I think that when you're first starting out, and every day, as you're a practitioner, you should think about these things. You should think about what the Buddha has actually taught. that all sentient beings are revolving in cyclic existence, and that cyclic existence is filled with suffering, and that suffering is based on desire. It comes from desire. You should think about the perception of self-nature. Think about this process of distinction that you consistently go through, distinguishing self from other. Think about the reaction that you engage in. Think about the exaggeration that comes from that. The primary exaggeration, the one that I didn't even get into, the one of hope and fear, the very basis for desire. If we think about that, if we really understand that to the depth of our being, it really motivates us. It gives us the foundation for practice. It gives us the strength to practice. We should never practice because someone told us to or because it's time to. We should practice because our eyes are open. You know, we really understand this. We really see this. We get the big picture. That's really important. The reason why I'm teaching such a complicated thought to those of you that may only be beginners, at least on the Buddhist path, or may be just starting in meditation, or maybe on and off about meditation, or whatever, is because if you think like that, you'll have more strength. You won't just flake out after a while. You really get it. You really think about it. You really own up to the fact that continuing in this way, just like reacting and exaggerating and blah, blah, blah like that, is nowhere. It's nowhere. It's a dead-end street. It leads to nothing but more discomfort. And so based on that kind of decision, on that kind of smart thinking, you really realize that there's no choice but to practice. One must have pure perception. One must eliminate desire. One must break through, cut through this reactive process. One must see through the delusion of such distinction and the belief in self-nature, and one must actually begin to awaken to the natural primordial wisdom state, which is like innate wakefulness. The uncontrived primordial view, which is our true nature. And like what I taught the children this morning, it's pure perception. It's like being in the Pure Land. It's like moving oneself from ignorance into bliss, to perceive in such a way. But even though we suffer in samsara, we don't seem to have the energy to pull ourselves out of it. It's just such a drag, and it pulls us back, and we can't quite get ourselves out. Maybe if you think about some of the things that we've talked about this morning, it might help a little bit. You might remind yourself that this is a dream-like thing, a drug-like thing. And it's just like a squirrel cage phenomena of perception and reaction and exaggeration. But there is something else. There is a purer, uncontrived view. That is what the Buddha said when he described himself as being simply awake. In that state of innate wakefulness, free of all that bias and perceptual reaction and all that gobbledygook that I just described, one no longer has the building blocks for suffering, because the reaction and the desire are simply not there. They've been pacified. And so therefore one abides in a spontaneous and natural way in a state of bliss. And one attains one's true state, one's natural state, which is happiness, just like that little boy said. Happy. So for those of you that are beginning to practice, I hope that that's helpful to you as a guide, as something to really chew on. I hope you chew on it. I hope you don't just glaze over and forget about it. I hope you really chew on it and decide for yourself what you should do. And for those of you that have been practicing, please remember why. Don't just practice by rote. You get into the housewife syndrome. You know what the housewife syndrome is? You have to get creative about cooking every day at 6. This gets a bigger laugh usually from women than it does from men. We can understand this. At any rate, thank you very much for coming today.
Julie.